Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the first talk of the University of Virginia East Asia Center's Spring 2021 Speakers Series. So I'm John Shepard, Emeritus Professor in the Anthropology Department. The next East Asia Center talk will be 2 weeks from today on February 19th about a musical based on the true stories of the Shanghai Jewish refugees during World War II. If you would like to receive notices of forthcoming talks, please send an email to eac@virginia.edu to be put on the mailing list. So now let me turn to the pleasure of introducing Tim Grose as our speaker today. He's an old friend and graduate of UVA's master's program in East Asian Studies. So Tim began his studies at UVA in the fall of 2005, and then immediately left us to spend 2006 in China studying the situation in Xinjiang and among Uyghurs in Beijing on a Fulbright scholarship. But he returned and completed his East Asian Studies MA thesis on the cultural politics of Uyghur education, then graduated in spring 2007. And after receiving his MA, Tim then went on to what is really the premier doctoral program in Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, where he received his PhD in 2014. For the last decade and a half then, Tim has been studying the cultural impacts of government policies on Uyghurs and Uyghur identity. He's published many articles and book chapters on topics ranging from bilingual and boarding school education, dress codes and female adornment, transformations of domestic space, and the practice of Islam. In 2019, Hong Kong University Press published Tim's new book, Negotiating Inseparability in China, Boarding School Education and the Dynamics of Uyghur Ethno-National Identity, which won the Central Eurasian Studies Society's 2020 Book Award. Since 2014, Tim has been a professor of China Studies at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, Indiana. And last but not least, on top of his scholarly productivity, we also congratulate Tim and his wife, who are the parents of 2-year-old twin girls. Tim's talk today is Uyghurs Are Uyghurs, They Aren't Muslim, end quote, forging modern Chinese citizens in Xinjiang. So let me turn it over to Tim. Welcome.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. And I was saying before we went live, unfortunately, I've given a lot of these talks about the ongoing crisis in Uyghur communities in Xinjiang since really 2018. And I just gave one yesterday for a student group at Rutgers, but there's always added pressure when you're in a room, even though this is a virtual room, with your former professors and advisors. You always want to make sure you're on your best game, and you don't want to disappoint, because you wouldn't be where you were or where you are without the guidance. And at that when I was at UVA, I was a very young, immature graduate student, and so really the patience of your mentors. So I want to make sure that their time wasn't in vain. And so again, there's a little bit of added pressure today. So let me start by sharing my screen, and we'll go ahead and begin. Oh, I'm just gonna move this. There we go. Okay, so does everyone now see my screen?
Yeah, looks good.
That's good. Okay, Yeah, so the title of today's talk is Uyghurs are Uyghurs, they are Muslim, forging modern Chinese citizens in Xinjiang. And I'd like to thank my friend Ellen Mosman, who helped me put together this picture. This is from one government cadre's blog from the same day, but three separate pictures. So she helped me stitch them together. As you'll see, they've been given T-shirts, and then they've been told to wear these T-shirts. And I think this is really reflective of what's going on. So kind of placing a veneer on what the Chinese Communist Party views as unrefined Uyghur people, and what this forging the new modern Chinese identity on these Turkic people, what these ramifications and implications are. So here we go. So before we start with the current situation, I think it's important to take a few steps back. And I never know where exactly to start in conversations about the current crisis, because it didn't begin in 2016 with the promotion of Chen Chongguo as the party secretary and then mass incarcerations. It didn't begin in 2009 with the Urumqi riots. It didn't begin in 1949, so we have to keep going back. But of course, we have a time limit too, so we can't discuss the entire history. But I want us to look at this map and at least appreciate the distance between Kashgar and Beijing. In fact, Kashgar is 20 kilometers closer to Mecca than it is to Beijing. And so historically, Kashgar, which is really the cultural and religious heart of Uyghur communities and modern Uyghur identity, was more influenced by Central Asian and Islamic cultural norms. And the influence from these Chinese cultural cores really, even through the Qing dynasty up to the Republican era, which ended, of course, in 1949, there is very little influence in Uyghur communities, especially in the southern regions now in Xinjiang, so Kashgar, Hotan, etc. So certainly, Uyghur identity and Uyghur expressions of culture today are influenced by Islam, and they're expressed in what we can consider Islamic norms. Now, this is not to say that all Uyghurs are Muslim. In fact, there are secular Uyghurs, there are atheist Uyghurs, there are Uyghurs who have converted to Christianity, but still their culture has been shaped pretty much the last 400 years by Islam. So expressions like Assalamu alaikum, washing your hands with a pitcher instead of a basin, almost a universal taboo against pork. They're shared by Uyghurs regardless of what faith they profess. So Uyghur culture is, again, is grounded in Islamic and Central Asian cultural norms. So with this in mind, the Chinese Communist Party had a task in 1949 when they declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Like Tibetans and Mongols, they were faced with a people that were linguistically, culturally, and then geographically very distant from the Chinese heartland. And so like other autonomous areas in China, so there are five large, kind of a provincial level autonomous regions. The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region was supposed to give special status to the Uyghurs. And in fact, the language states that they have the rights to protect and develop their languages and cultures. But really since the there were fluctuating policies, and of course in the Maoist era, there was very little room to express ethnic cultures, and actually very little room to express quote unquote traditional Chinese culture. But still, after a brief period of relaxation in the 1980s, by the 1990s, the Chinese Communist Party began to restrict the ways that Uyghurness was performed. There were fewer spaces in society in which Uyghur language is spoken. There were more restrictions on the ways that that piety can be expressed publicly. And again, it's all within this kind of this racialized idea of everyone belonging to the Chinese nation, the Zhonghua Minzu. So in addition to what became increasingly assimilatory policies, the Chinese Communist Party also engaged in both direct and indirect population changes in the region. And as we see at the beginning of 1949, the People's Republic of China, there were very few Han people living in Xinjiang. But we fast forward to 2010, which is the most recent census. The 2020 census should be out fairly soon if it's not already out. But in any case, we fast forward to 2010, we see now the dramatic population shifts in the area, where now Uyghurs constitute for about 45% of the total population, whereas Han make up about 40% of the population. And again, so all of these are gathering for almost a perfect storm. So we have assimilatory policies, we have dramatic demographic changes in the region, and still under the idea or under the law of regional ethnic autonomy, Uyghurs still have very little meaningful political power. And this is reflected in who actually holds the position of party secretary in the region. The party secretary is the individual who possesses and wields the most political influence. And as we see through this list, starting from Wang Zhen in 1949 and then ending with the present party secretary, Chen Chongguo, with the exception of Saifuddin Azizi during the Cultural Revolution. Of course, everything is chaotic in the Cultural Revolution. No Uyghur has held the most important position in Xinjiang. It's always been he has always been the governor and therefore subordinate to the party secretary. So over time, again, everything is gathering. Over time, this discontent begins to simmer until it finally boils over July 5th, 2009. And there were some sporadic violence in the early 1990s in Barron Township, and of course, 1997 in Holja. In fact, today marks the anniversary of the 1997 Holja incident. And then there were there was a bombing in Urumqi shortly after the shortly after the Holja incident. But really things came to a head on July 5th, 2009, with massive protests that spiraled into riots in the provincial capital of Urumqi. Now, what sparked the riots was an incident that happened in Shaoguan in southeastern China, where Han and Chinese factory workers clashed, leaving two Uyghur and Chinese and Han Chinese workers clashed, leaving two Uyghur workers dead, when rumors began to circulate that Uyghur workers were sexually harassing young women. Now, Uyghurs in Urumqi believed that the government response to the murderers was too lenient, and they were demanding political action and justice to be brought to the killers of their co-ethnics. As I mentioned, the protests spiraled into violence that lasted over 3 days and claimed over 200 lives, injured over 2,000. The vast majority of deaths were unfortunately Han Chinese. So this marks the beginning of really a kind of a military military clampdown in the region. So beginning in 2010, and I actually was in Xinjiang, visited several times between 2006 and 2008. I had plans of going in summer of 2009, but of course didn't after the riots. But when I returned in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 17, um, military presence could be seen everywhere. And this is taken from, these shots are taken from the Xinjiang Daily News, and then on the left, Xinjiang TV2, which is in Xinjiang TV5, which are uh, Uyghur language television stations that I used to be able to stream from my home up until 2017. And then I think what happened was I began to share my screenshots on social media, and then we were no longer able to access these sites. But still, we had this very obvious heavy military presence in the region, and especially between 2010 and 2014. Um, every major intersection in Urumqi, every major important government office had at least a squad of 10 or so fully armed, either paramilitary personnel or soldiers. So again, we had this um, very kind of almost surreal environment in Xinjiang. Now, the government clampdown on the Uyghurs produced reactionary violence. And this map shows 6 of the most violent episodes or deadly episodes, some of which fall under the conventional definitions of terrorism. And we shouldn't forget that. And it also begins to spill over outside of Xinjiang, most notably in Kunming, in Yunnan, and in Beijing. But 2 narratives begin to emerge. One of the narratives is, and the one that's being promoted by the Chinese Communist Party to this day, is that China is and was under assault by Islamist groups and international terrorist organizations. However, most scholars believe and have found very little evidence of the violence perpetrated by Uyghurs to be at any way associated or connected to global Islamist groups. Rather, the violence has been reaction to colonialism in the region, and we can kind of break that down into 4 main components: territorial conquest that goes all the way back to the Qing dynasty. We've already mentioned the idea of having indigenous elites subordinate to a majority elites, hierarchy of language. Now, basically, what's now called the national language, Mandarin or Putonghua, has replaced Uyghur as the most important language for education, business, and law. And the idea that legally Uyghurs and Han people share the same freedoms and are equal, but actually how that is experienced in society is much different. So I'd rather defer to one of my colleagues, who's probably the leading scholar on Uyghur resistance to Chinese rule in Xinjiang, who's recently published his book, China's War on the Uyghurs. And he summarizes the violence up to 2014 as such. He says, as the state increasingly profiled Uyghurs as a threat, kept them under constant surveillance, and marginalized them in their own homeland, it was almost inevitable that the Uyghur response to these pressures would be violent rage. So again, he's not condoning this violence. In fact, he condemns the violence like we all do, but he's showing, and I think he does so convincingly, that this is not part of, again, these global terrorist networks. Nevertheless, the Chinese Communist Party acted with impunity, and they began to criminalize the entire Uyghur ethno-national group. And they did so by first building these, what are known officially in Chinese as concentration or concentrated transformation through education centers or re-education centers. Now, in 2016, I began hearing rumors about mass incarcerations of Uyghurs, but believed and hoped that they were just that, they were just rumors. But in 2017, which has been my latest and perhaps my final visit to the region, I spoke to a Uyghur friend who was employed with the government, who just returned from a homestay program that we will talk about a little bit later in Hotan. He confirmed that yes, the Chinese Communist Party was incarcerating large number of Uyghurs. And unfortunately, a mutual friend of ours, whom we knew and hung out together in Beijing, had been detained after he returned home from Turkey, where he was studying, to attend a family wedding. And then government workers began to post evidence, visual evidence of these concentration re-education centers. And initially, the Chinese Communist Party denied their existence. Later, they will say that they were providing vocational training and facilities for surplus laborers. But before that, there was radio silence, at least officially. But on Chinese social media, government cadres and sent down workers began posting their experiences. And these are all pictures that were taken inside these so-called either re-education centers or re-education bases, all of which, these are all of which I have found myself. And the one on the, you can't see my hand, where my hand's pointing, but the individual behind the microphone, you can see quite clearly in Chinese and Uyghur that it's celebrating the opening of one of these re-education centers. Now, what was, I think, most disturbing about these centers, in addition to the numbers, and I've never gone on record to put an estimate on the numbers. I don't know how many people have been detained. I have a ongoing database where I just count exact numbers that are listed by government workers and cadres, and right now my list is at over 13,000. But again, I don't know how many have been detained. But what was more troubling, I think, and disturbing is that it wasn't. It was targeting all Uyghurs, and especially cultural icons, professionals, and academics, and many of whom I knew personally and knew them to be secular. And so this was really the first, I think, the first important piece of evidence suggesting that the CCP really wasn't interested in preventing extremism, the spread of extremism, but rather they sought to isolate the spread of Uyghur culture defined and promulgated by Uyghurs themselves, and especially this kind of Uyghur culture that is grounded in Islamic and Central Asian cultural norms. Now, we have these concentration re-education centers, but that doesn't mean that if somehow you were able to avoid this literal incarceration, that somehow your life was okay and it went on as normal. Because outside of the re-education centers, the CCP installed a high-tech police state, which basically has been established to monitor the movements and behaviors of all the citizens, especially Uyghurs. And this began really prior to 2016 with the demolition of Uyghur neighborhoods, and in their place, the construction of these kind of large boulevards and the replacement of mahalla communities that are characterized by long snaking alleyways and close neighbors. And what actually creates these communities are mosques, right? So they're kind of organized around mosques. And in their place, we have these high-rise apartments and large, wide boulevards, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, one can easily say, well, this is going on throughout China. And in fact, we can point to examples in Beijing with the demolition of hutongs. And so what I want us to do is not isolate these policies. But again, we have to think about these policies holistically, right? Because they're all working in tandem for a greater, for this kind of greater objective. So now that we have these cityscapes, these urban areas that are more easily controllable, more easily surveyable, the Chinese Communist Party began to establish what they considered zero proximity law enforcement. And so By 2017, during my last visit, there were 7,500 of these so-called convenience police stations in Urumqi streets alone, that staffed over 10,000 security personnel. And the idea was if there was anything, if anything was going to happen, they could arrive to the scene within seconds. And I did my own measurement. And in Uyghur communities in Urumqi, there was a convenience police station every 200 meters. So in addition to these police stations, you also have the installation and the maintenance of high-tech security cameras. And many of these were facing mosques. Now, of course, security cameras exist everywhere. There are security cameras that line the streets of New York City. But keep this image in mind because in a moment, we'll see what's going on behind these cameras. Now, we have a little bit of a technical glitch here. So we're not going to be able to spend too much time on the changing of soundscapes, but suffice it to say that currently in Xinjiang, the call to prayer cannot be amplified. So in Kashgar in 2013, I was able to hear the vocal recitation of the call to prayer. Here, 2017 in Urumqi, it was a recording call to prayer, but it was barely audible from my position, which is about 50 feet away from the mosque entrance. And so maybe that was one of the reasons we couldn't hear it. But again, so we have this kind of the muting of Islamic soundscapes. And it's not just the sound, but these are these call to prayers organized a day for pious Muslims, right? I mean, their days are organized around the 5 daily prayers. Oh, and we can't hear that, but hold on. And I gotta turn this off. 1 second. No one's hearing that, are they?
No.
In any case, now, in the place, by 2017, there were this ethnic harmony anthem that was required to be played by every storefront. And this literally drowned out the sound of the call to prayer when it was being said. And you couldn't go anywhere in the city without hearing this song. So it was as if the Chinese Communist Party developed and looped its own soundtrack to the city. So they quite literally changed the rhythm, changed the beat of life in Xinjiang. And well, I'm gonna, there we go. My sound was, so I'm gonna share this again. Okay, now it's easier to monitor life in the city where people live in closer proximity, but that didn't always work, and it's harder to execute in the countryside. So in the countryside, there's been a little bit of a different strategy, and it's best encapsulated by the 3 News campaign, which was introduced in 2017 and 2018. And the idea is to make these hard to get to places more legible, and of course, I'm drawing on James Scott here, more legible in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, we don't have time to scrutinize all the language of the 3 News campaign, but I do want to point out some of the, I think, important highlights of the language, because it becomes very apparent that this isn't about modernization, and it's more about the imposition of new cultural norms. And as we can see, under the advocating a new lifestyle, there's priority placed on uprooting ignorance, discarding pagan ideas, eliminating the 4 activities. Now, the 4 activities refer to the 4 common life cycle rituals of Muslims: naming ceremonies, circumcisions, weddings, funerals. If we move forward here, we have these ideas of against old customs, and finally, encourage a secular lifestyle, right? So again, embedded in this official language is, I think, the more important objective, as opposed to this kind of generic modernization of introducing and imposing new cultural norms on Uyghur people. And this was carried out in the home. And before we look at the new ways Uyghur spaces are organized, we should have some sort of familiarity of what the Uyghur home was prior to these campaigns. And so we're going to take a brief tour of a Uyghur home. So most often, a Uyghur home is separated from the outside alley by these two-door gates. And upon entering the gate into the home, I took out a slide because I thought I had too many. There's usually an outdoor courtyard. When you enter the home, the most important room in terms of everyday functionality and use is the dalan. And this is where the most informal visits occur. Entertain guests, entertain neighbors, watch TV. Most meals are shared in the dalan. And what really kind of anchors the dalan is a piece of furniture, so to speak, called a supa, which is usually built anywhere between 12 feet by 15 feet and about 23 inches above the ground. And this is really the center of activity in the Uyghur home. Again, meals were often shared there. This would be the place where families would watch TV together. In winter months, family members would often share the supa and sleep together. And some important life cycle rituals were also took place on the supa. So it was also the place within the home that blurred the secular and the sacred. In addition to the dalan, we have the sarai, or the mehmankhana, and this is maybe most akin to a formal dining room. And so most days, if the family had a sarai or a mehmankhana, was pretty much lifeless. That's how Jay Doucher described it in his just magnificent ethnography. But if there was a special event, guests would congregate in the sarai. But again, most days the lights were off. It was just extra storage, especially of bedding and fine porcelains. Well, we see a general layout of these Uyghur homes, and this is from a Uyghur architecture book, and we see the kind of the central area, and then the central area branching out into other rooms. With the 3 News campaign, a new blueprint of Uyghur domestic space was introduced and imposed, and replacing the organizational schemes that we saw on the previous slide are the so-called 3 separate spaces. And the 3 separate spaces refer to the living spaces or the residential spaces, the growing spaces, which were small plots for gardens, and rearing spaces where families can have maybe some chickens and some sheep. And then so all Uyghur homes have to, in the rural areas, have to conform to this blueprint, either by renovating their current home or by moving into affordable housing. Now, what's interesting, I think, is the layout or our architectural genotype of the 3 News campaign. And we can see that no longer do we have what is known in architecture as either the loopy or ringy organization, but rather what's being imposed is a linear organization of space. And if we draw on Glover's analysis of the reordering of housing in Lahore, we learned that the delineation of spaces for living, farming, and rearing try to increase domestic efficiency. And according to Glover, and here I'm quoting, the result of this reorganization of space was the formation of new domestic habits, sensibilities, sentiments that would be cultivated and disciplined in the newly remade spaces of the home. So again, it's not just about introducing a new a new structure, but what the new structure does, how the new structure conditions the way one lives out his or her life. And in these new homes, whether they're renovated or whether Uyghurs are being moved into affordable housing, they don't have interior earthen supa. So there are still some homes that have supa made of wood, and most of the time they're on the outside in the so-called chaihana or the pavilion. But cadres began posting pictures of Uyghurs destroying their supa, sometimes with the help of the Han cadres themselves. And this is important because the elimination of the supa is effectively eliminates that space in the Uyghur home, as I mentioned earlier, that blurs the division between the sacred and the profane. Now that no longer exists. Also missing from these new homes, whether they're renovated or whether they're newly built, are the grab that were often carved inside the home that faces the direction, or that indicates the direction of Mecca. Now, I actually haven't seen this clearly stated in government documents. There was one RFA report that says that these mihrab are illegal, but again, I haven't seen this language appear in any of the primary sources. But I've searched literally hundreds of pictures of newly renovated Uyghur homes in these affordable housing, and I have yet to see a mihrab. So I think it's safe to say that they are no longer allowed to be placed inside the home. And there are social pressures for Uyghur families to conform to these new regulations. So officials conduct what are known as the inspections of the five beauties. You know, is the house being upkept? Is everything laid out beautifully, et cetera, et cetera? And if they pass these inspections, they're given these door plaques, right, that show that they're compliant of the policies. Now, for those who have gone above and beyond the expectations, and you can see on my right this fabric banner, they're given this rotating banner that sets them apart, that this is the family that other families should emulate. Now, those who fail to meet the standards, they risk public humiliation. Oftentimes, they'll have to be paraded in front of their peers during the weekly flag raising ceremonies. So prior to the COVID outbreak, and they're reinstituting these right now, but prior to the COVID outbreak, in Xinjiang, Mondays were reserved for community-wide flag raising ceremonies. There was no way to be exempt from them. If you continued to disobey or to not conform to these beautiful spaces campaigns, you were given deadlines and, as I mentioned, paraded on stage. And sometimes, if you still fail to comply, that would have you sent to re-education. So, okay, so hopefully we have this kind of spatial visualization of what's going on in Xinjiang, that we started at the very, very top. We went through the cities, we're going down to the countryside, to the home. Now we're going inside the home. And since 2016, actually the program began in 2015, but was really accelerated in 2016, are the so-called sent home or sent down workers, or the family stay programs. And according to May 30th, 2018, so again, this is a screenshot I took from the nightly news in Xinjiang. The sent down youth, or the sent down workers, made 24 million house visits and conducted 33 million interviews. And as we'll see, they're more like interrogations, and organized 8 million ethnic unity activities in Uyghur communities. And these sent down workers began to blog about their experiences living in close proximity with Uyghurs in their homes. And deception helps some work teams get in. Here we have one one entry by a young woman who was in charge of some of these home inspections and home visits. And she basically says, allow a female cadre to knock on the door because, I'm sorry, the person who's likely going to greet the visitor will be another female. And if it's a man that's knocking on the door and the female answers because of Islamic modesty norms, that could create some social pressures and maybe some social awkwardness. So it would be best if you had a local woman government official be the one knocking on the door, because it's most likely that a woman would answer, either because her husband was away at work or her husband was detained. And once you had access into the home, then the state sent down workers can begin to collect essentially human intelligence for each household. And as we see from this form, now this form has been converted into an app. I actually downloaded the app, but you had to, I didn't have the credentials to actually work the app. But it used to be a form, a paper form that they would then enter into a computer database. And it was again to find out the basic information of each family, with a special emphasis on religious practice. So we can see, in this survey, does the individual or does the family have religious beliefs? Is it a religious, is there a religious person, a religious cleric in the family? Are they part of the so-called targeted population? And all of these were, this information was assessed, and people in the village were given essentially labels, either safe, normal, or unsafe. And if you landed in the unsafe category, you're more likely to be detained. And here we have one entry that I've translated from a government blog, and I gave you one that would probably be in the safe category. So Ali Aishan is 36 years old, resident of village group 9, household of 3, earns 6,000 RMB. His family has already received the affordable housing subsidy. So again, he's already been conforming to the 3 News campaign. He has technical at school, and he hopes to earn a living reading life. So again, he's taken initiative to using official party speak here to throw off the hat of poverty. So he's likely safe. Now, even getting deeper into Uyghur communities, so we're already in the home, but now it's the focus, the targeting of the Uyghur individual himself or herself, and especially religious belief. And to be clear, there are religious freedoms in China, but the religious freedoms really stop after belief. And there's nothing that protects expressions of religion. And in fact, in Xinjiang, there are illegal religious activities. And this is from a poster in Urumqi. They were hung throughout every city in Xinjiang. In addition, every religious site had to have one of these outside of the premises. And as we look at the language of the illegal religious activities, we can begin to see how ambiguous and arbitrary they are, especially if you look down at number 20, disseminating any messages that do not align with the ideas of the party and the People's Republic of China, and 23, using religion to organize activities that can hinder social order. So again, these were kind of the catch-alls that made any sort, that could potentially make any example a form of religious expression susceptible to restrictions or oppression. Now, Chinese state media will say, well, there's no repression of religion in Xinjiang. Xinjiang has 24,000 mosques, more mosques than the United States. But what they don't tell you is the restrictions that are placed on those who participate in communal prayer. In fact, and this is from a photo I took in Turpan, minors, college students, and anyone employed by the government and their immediate families are forbidden from praying. remember the images of the mosques in Urumqi from a few slides back. Well, urban areas, Urumqi, Kashgar City, Khotan City, this one is in Khotan, link all of these cameras or outside cameras and interior cameras, and there are these centers that monitor all the mosque activities using centralized surveillance equipment. And what's especially monitored are the sermons, the weekly sermons. And of course, they have to be given by state-appointed imams. In rural areas that might not have access to the high-tech surveillance or haven't been connected to these centralized systems yet, they dispatch work teams and they monitor and record who goes in and out of the mosques. And finally, there are mosques being destroyed. ASPI, an Australian think tank, has more information on this. This is just from one government blog or government cadres blog that I found. They use the language of adjusted mosque numbers because of changes in residential patterns. This particular city or this particular community had their number of mosques, quote unquote, adjusted from 10 to 4. So how about Ramadan? Because again, the Chinese state media will say there are no restrictions on Ramadan, but if we actually look at the information coming out by government workers, we see that there are very, very few people who are actually permitted to fast during Ramadan. So here we have guardians of students in Hoja in the far north of the region. They pledge not to fast during Ramadan, and they promise to provide 3 meals a day to their children and tell them the benefits of the habit and the vow to keep them away from any religious site or activities. So again, even if minors, of course, are disallowed or forbidden from fasting, but in many communities, parents of students are no longer able to fast. Retired government workers also pledge not to fast or act to prevent them from being so-called two-faced person, or someone that benefited from the party, was a party member, but still retained religious sensibilities. Now, some places, although they may not have explicit prohibitions against fasting, they will encourage eating during Ramadan, and sometimes they will organize dinner events during Ramadan where they expect everyone to attend. And they say this is to strengthen relationships between the CCP and all ethnic groups. But of course, they are organized during daylight hours during Ramadan. And here again, we see another example of teachers pledging that neither they nor their family will fast, wear religious clothing, etc. So this very, very crude flow chart that I tried to cobble together, you can see I have very, very little skills in any sort of visual arts, shows that for many people, it's absolutely illegal, non-negotiable to fast during Ramadan. So if you're a minor, if you're a student, if you're employed as a police officer, a teacher, a government worker, it's all illegal. And in many cases, also, if you're a retired worker, it's illegal. And other demographics, it depends on the locality. So do you have a child in school? Well, that doesn't seem to be enforced provincially wide, but for many localities, it's the case. But regardless, you're discouraged from fasting. So let's look at one final example of these kind of clampdowns on religious expressions. So the first two, praying and fasting, are two of the 5 pillars of Islamic faith. Now, this would be considered Sunnah or the path of Muhammad. So not a pillar of faith, but still part of living a pious Muslim life. And one of the life cycle rituals that are important to Muslim communities, including Uyghurs, is the naming ceremony. Up until most recently, naming ceremonies required the attendance of a religious cleric, usually an imam, who would face Mecca. And here we have the mihrab, and we've already talked about how mihrab are no longer visible in newly renovated and newly built Uyghur homes. And the imam will recite the call to prayer in the infant's right ear, and then the takbir or Allahu Akbar in the infant's left ear. And then afterwards, all in attendance would recite the newborn's name. Now there are restrictions on this. And as remember, we go back to the language of the 3 News campaign. They singled out the so-called 4 activities, naming ceremony being one of them. And so now all non-CCP members are encouraged to hold ceremonies in these newly constructed premises called villager service centers. So essentially concrete spaces that were built by the government. Now, even if you decide, if you're, for example, if your community does not have a villager service center and you are required to hold the ceremony at home, you have to have a party official in attendance. And so you can't just hold the ceremony anytime you want. There's an application process. The petition has to be, for the ceremony has to be approved, and they have to be sure there's a party member assigned and who will attend the ceremony. Now, some families have replaced religious clerics with officials who will preside over the naming ceremony, but that's not a requirement yet. But if you're employed with the government or an official, it's completely forbidden, absolutely forbidden to invite a religious cleric to the naming ceremonies. And they're no longer able to use quote unquote religious names, but only traditional Uyghur names. And all Uyghurs, in fact, are now prohibited from naming their children with quote unquote overtly Islamic names. And so what I'm showing here is, this is a handbook of Uyghur names that was published by a state press in the mid 2000s. And again, so this has passed the censors, and common Uyghur names of this time were Hajim, Imam, Muhammad, or Mehmet, which are variants of Muhammad, the prophet, names of the prophet's wives, etc. But these began to fall under the ambiguous category of overtly Islamic names, and then therefore it brought political pressure on Uyghurs. And so Uyghur families began to change the names of either themselves or their children. And these are name changes that I found in the Xinjiang Daily, and what I've censored is their ID numbers, because their ID numbers were also included in there. But again, you can see that they're announcing the name changes in the paper. So my son's former name was Qadruddin Mahmud, so Mahmud being a variant of Muhammad. I changed his name to Qadruddin Muhammad Yusuf. So here's another one. I was named Abdul Qadir, Abu Bakr, one of the 4 rightly guided ones, Qadir. From this day forward, my name is Astar. My daughter's original name was Aisha. I changed her name to Arzul, and then her address. So, okay, where is this all going? Well, hopefully the talk has demonstrated, and convincingly so, that the series of policies in Uyghur communities, so I'm talking about mass detentions, redefining space, curbing Islamic practice, even controlling names of Uyghurs, is not intended to combat a terrorist threat that in reality doesn't exist and didn't exist. Rather, it's meant to fundamentally change the ways Uyghurs think about themselves and express their identities. And so I want to leave you with these remarks from a Uyghur official in Khotan, in Malabashi County, who urged his comrades to maintain Marxist-Leninist purity, and he demanded, if we Uyghurs, if we aren't Muslims and we are atheists, why must we invite clerics to engage in religious rituals at name-giving ceremonies, et cetera, et cetera. And he adds, Uyghurs, they aren't Muslims, and we must make this concept clear. But I think what's interesting about this quote is it's said in Chinese. And so he's already using a Sinified version of Uyghurs. It's not Uyghur, it's Weiwarzu. And so already from the inception of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Uyghurs were visualized as being Chinified, as being Sinified. But now what we're seeing is this visualization, the process of this visualization becoming a reality, right? And so it's about taking Uyghurs and turning them into Weiwars. So there's where I'll leave my final remarks, and I'm happy and delighted to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. So let's see.
And should I stop sharing screen?
I think that's right. Is that right, Brian?
Well, I will anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Brian, I'm probably going to need your help here, but in the Q&A or in the chat, let's see, we have quite a number of people. Let's see if we have anyone who's seeking to raise a question. So I'm not sure, can you see this question and answer panel, Tim?
Oh yeah,
or-
I just opened it. Yep.
Good. So maybe you can, I'm not sure, can the audience see the questions? I guess. Anyway, maybe I'll read the question and you can formulate your answer.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one says, many well-respected, highly educated people in China refuse to comment on Xinjiang or say that there is no problem in Xinjiang. How can we approach this topic with them to actually have a conversation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one I'm afraid I don't have an answer to. There is an organization called Chinese for Uyghurs, and they have a presence on social media, especially on Twitter, and they provide strategies for how to, especially from students from Chinese backgrounds in the United States who are concerned about this, how to talk about the situation with their families back in the People's Republic of China. But yes, it's a very, very sensitive topic, especially in China. There's a lot of misunderstanding between Uyghurs and Han people, a lot of misconceptions, a lot of stereotypes that have strained the relationships. And so I encourage especially if you're from a Chinese background and you want to discuss this with your family in China, that you speak with other Chinese who are also engaging in these conversations. And so, yeah, Chinese for Uyghurs is an important, important resource for that.
Our next question is from Amber Bullock. It says, what is happening to the Uyghurs is very similar to the Chinese Cultural Revolution from the 20th century and didn't end until Mao passed away. How long do you think this type of treatment of the Uyghurs will continue? Do you think more radical steps will be taken by the government to make the Uyghurs conform to be more Han Chinese?
Yeah, I think the comparison with the Cultural Revolution is interesting and potentially informative. I think the one difference with the Cultural Revolution and what's going on in Xinjiang right now is that a lot of the violence from the Cultural Revolution was more organic, right? It wasn't necessarily controlled by the top or and controlled by the very the local levels of government, but more there was this kind of this kind of primal chaos going on. But I think that the Cultural Revolution, as an example, also provides some hope because we saw after the death of Mao in 1976, a loosening of policies, kind of a rectification of the imposition of these kind of these very, very strict and violent assimilatory practices. And so hopefully we'll see another loosening of policies with yeah, and again with Xi Jinping now not knowing when the end of his tenure will be. I don't know when this will be, but you know, hopefully in time, the current leaders in Beijing will realize that they're actually creating more harm and instability in their country by resorting to these extreme measures, and there'll be a loosening of restrictions. In the near future, though, I don't know how more radical the government could be in trying to impose this assimilation of Uyghurs.
So our next question is great talk. How would you gloss or react to the use or characterization by the US government officials of Chinese government policy with regard to Uyghurs as quote unquote genocide?
Yeah, I've never used genocide in any public venue, honestly, because there's a whole literature on what genocide is, and I'm unfamiliar with it. And so I leave these politicized terms up for legal experts. I think regardless of how we debate the terms, that this sort of state violence is condemnable by all countries and all people, regardless of what we call it. And I think what's more important than the terms that we apply to them is meaningful action that will hopefully sway the Chinese Communist Party's its approach to acculturating, or more like assimilating the Uyghurs. So I'm kind of dodging the question. Yeah, but like, again, I think it's more important that there is global condemnation of this violence, and I'll let the legal experts decide on what it is.
Our next question is, how is getting along with Han Chinese seen among Uyghurs? Do you have any sense that people are shamed within the community for following CCP rules, or is everyone just trying to survive what is widely understood? Also, do you think there's anything that's going to change the situation? What pressures do you think the Chinese would respond to stop what they're doing?
Yeah, because I did a lot of my dissertation research in Beijing amongst Uyghurs who were part of a boarding school program. And when you speak individually, Uyghurs have Han Chinese friends, and very close Han Chinese friends. Now, sometimes when it gets into romantic relationships, there's more of a taboo there, but that I think has more to do with religious differences in marrying with the potential of marrying non-Muslims. But now I think survival is the most important thing, and there's if you don't follow the CCP rule, the consequences are much greater than any sort of social stigma. So again, everyone is, I think, looking out for himself and herself and their family. And so any sort of resistance isn't even an option on the table. So in fact, on my Weixin page, at the height of incarcerations in 2017 and flowing into 2018, Uyghurs who were either just kind of casually dissatisfied with the CCP and sometimes very vocal, at least in private, they began on their Weixin pages for National Holiday on October 1st to post all these very, very patriotic messages and pictures, how much they appreciated the party and how much they were grateful for the party. So again, it's about performing this patriotism so there are no criminal consequences.
Our next question. I lived in Beijing for a few years. I was curious what your experiences were like as a foreigner exploring these political topics. Were you met with any conflict or consequences aside from the censorship on social media?
Surprisingly, no. And I think it depends on the venue for where these conversations occur. So amongst my close Han Chinese friends inside their home, we can have candid conversations about that. And then I spent a lot of times in Chinese institutions, specifically the Ming's University of China in Beijing, and then lesser so at Beijing University. And these were spaces that I think, curated conversations about what was going on in Xinjiang. Now, there are also venues in Beijing where these conversations can occur, but I wasn't in that crowd. So, for example, I gave a talk at Beijing University, and the host, this was in 2014, and the host told me last minute that there were going to be two officials from the State Ethnic Affairs um, uh, Committee, Council, State Ethnic Affairs Commission there. And so at the last minute, I had to change some of what I was going to say, because having government party representatives in the audience, I didn't feel like I had the same sort of academic freedom that I would have had if they weren't there.
Next question. Does the Chinese Communist Party's measures on the so-called vocational training center target Uyghurs or Muslims or all ethnic minorities living in Xinjiang?
Primarily the Turkic minorities. So in terms of incarcerations, we see the highest percentage of interned persons being Uyghur and Kazakh, with some Kyrgyz in there. Now there are examples of Hui and Han too, but they're not representative of the population. So this has produced, or this has actually generated several questions about what is the CCP actually targeting? Are they targeting Uyghurs for being Uyghurs? Are they targeting Turkic culture? Are they targeting Islam? And again, there's no consensus on what they're actually, if there's a certain element within these identities that they're trying to contain. But I think it's more of, even though there are some Hui and Han, they're the in these re-education centers, they're the exception. I think what the Chinese Communist Party is most intent on dissolving is the kind of the fusion of an ethno-national identity with religious sensibilities. And so with Hui people, right, you have religious sensibilities, but there's that lack of ethno-nationalism, right? There's no diaspora community thinking about more autonomy or their own country, et cetera. But with Kazakhs, with their co-ethnics in Kazakhstan, and of course with active diaspora communities and governments in exile amongst Uyghurs, we have this fusion of ethno-nationalism and religious sensibilities. And I think that's the most pressing concern for the Chinese Communist Party.
Next question from Professor Brad Reed. Given the sensitivity of all this, how did you gain access, and are you now persona non grata as are others who study the region?
Yeah, well, technically, I still have an active 10-year visa for China, though I don't think I wouldn't dare go right now. Now, gaining access, again, I was invited several times to speak about Xinjiang and policies there by institutions in China. I taught a 3-week course at Xinjiang Normal University. And so at one time I was a quote unquote friend of China, and professionals at least maybe not sought my opinion, but at least respected my opinion enough that they invited me to talk at their institutions. And in gaining access, it was things got more complicated in the 2000 teens, and there were fewer institutions that would formally support my visa. So I went as a tourist, on a tourist visa, and just did ethnographic work, not affiliated with the university. And certainly now, I don't think I'm invited to return. And certainly, if the number of Chinese diplomats that have blocked me on Twitter is any indication, I'm not a very close friend to any top-ranking official in the Communist Party right now.
Next question. How do you, from Amber Bullock again, how do you feel about the Uyghur home being dismantled? Do you think this will affect future generations of Uyghur, causing them to lose a part of the culture that was religiously and culturally important to their way of life? Or are Uyghurs today trying to maintain some of these important practices?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that's the intention. The intention is to sever that transmission of cultural knowledge through generations. And the Uyghur home being an important site, especially since it's organized in the ways Uyghurs visualize the world. And yeah, I mean, certainly it is going to have impacts on younger generations, but I think what's going to have even a more devastating impact are, again, my research was on boarding schools, the number of students who are being educated outside of the region, outside of their home, the number of individuals, the number of children who have had both parents incarcerated, the replacement of Uyghur in schools with Mandarin. Now, that's not to say that Uyghur is not taught anymore, but it has a very, very small space within the national curriculum. That these policies are going to have more devastating impacts. Essentially, you're going to have an entire generation of Uyghurs, of Uyghur elite who weren't educated in their own language. They can speak Uyghur, but again, in terms of intellectual capabilities, their language is like at a middle school level. And I think this is going to have a longer cultural impact, and it's a devastating one on Uyghur communities. Fortunately, there are efforts outside of China, especially in Turkey, Australia, in places in North America too, that are trying to protect and in many ways revitalize quote unquote Uyghur culture in exile. So right now they're shouldering the burden.
Next question from Nancy Damon: is the Chinese government pushing against other ethnic minorities, I guess, with similar policies?
Yes and no. So, of course, in China, there are 56 ethnic groups, Han majority, and then 55 ethnic minorities. And I think of the 55 ethnic minorities, there are only 3 ethno-national groups, or groups that again have this fusion of ethnic culture with nationalism. And so you have Uyghurs that we spoke about, Mongols, and we see some stricter policies being implemented in Inner Mongolia, and of course in Tibet, and Kazakhs are kind of on this on the border now. As among the other groups, the other 51 or so ethnic minorities, we don't see the same type of harsh treatment. And in fact, on paper, Chinese laws for ethnic minorities are good, and they've actually helped to revitalize ethnic cultures, revitalize ethnic languages, etc. And they promote these ethnic groups. But I think again, what becomes problematic is when the ethnic identity fuses with nationalism. So again, for the vast majority of the smaller ethno-national groups, well, Hui and Zhuang aren't small, but again, without this fusion of ethno-nationalism and ethnic culture, there's not a problem. In fact, many ethnic minorities have benefited from Chinese policy.
again from Brad Reed. Most of your talk focused on government policies. Do you have any sense of how these policies are seen among the population, perhaps the Han population as well as the Uyghur population?
Well, certainly, well, among the Han population, and I'm careful of who I speak to who in China now, but at least up until 2017, there was a general sense amongst Han friends and Han professionals and colleagues that Uyghurs were always ungrateful for what the government was providing for them. So that language education, Mandarin education was to their benefit. Urbanization was to their benefit. Even restriction on religious practice were to their benefit because these were backwards beliefs. So there was this idea that the government knew what was better for Uyghurs more than what the Uyghurs knew what was good for Uyghurs. So I think there's that general, again, I don't know how representative it is for all 1.2 billion, 1.1 billion Han Chinese, but I had the general sense that that Han people just didn't understand why Uyghurs were so upset. Now, amongst Uyghurs themselves, in my decade of going back and forth and living in China and speaking to Uyghurs and Uyghurs numbering in the hundreds, I could count on one hand the number of Uyghurs who were fully supportive of the policies that the CCP was introducing and imposing. Now, of course, I also have to think, well, my role as an ethnographer, may have elicited these answers. Maybe they thought that's what I wanted to hear. Of course, there's no way of actually knowing that. But yeah, even people who were happy to be Chinese citizens and benefit from the system, they remain really dissatisfied with restrictions on religious practice and language. And that was almost universal with all the Uyghurs I spoke to.
Next question, is there any way for Chinese nationals of other ethnic minorities in China, Hui, Mongolian, Miao, to manifest solidarity with Uyghurs?
That's unfortunately, I don't think there is. I mean, at least not publicly. Certainly, I haven't seen any, and I think the risks if you're a Chinese citizen and not Uyghur and then speak out against these policies right now, I just don't see it. In fact, there was someone just yesterday, an anonymous account on Weibo, another Chinese social media, that posted news about Rahilia Dawut, an individual I spoke about earlier, who was an esteemed professor at Xinjiang University. This person posted news of her disappearance, and the post was immediately taken off of Weibo. So yeah, I don't think there's any way to, at least again, publicly show solidarity.
Here's a question. What lessons or insights do you think we can draw from the history of North American residential schools, I presume among Native Americans?
Yeah, in fact, in my book, I draw on these Native American and Australian boarding schools as case studies, and yeah, certainly the strategies are essentially the same. It's these kind of very concerted efforts to change the cultural identities of these people. Of course, there's a famous saying amongst Native American boarding schools, or about the acculturation and assimilation of Native Americans, is kill the Indian, save the man. And we see similar strategies being employed by the Chinese Communist Party. I think the difference is that the Chinese Communist Party has more tools to work with. I mean, the US government, the Australian government, they eventually met their ends, and that was the assimilation and destruction of native cultures. But we're seeing this happen at an accelerated level in the People's Republic of China. And I mean, I think the lessons that should be gleaned from this is that these policies have devastating effects on people, and by making these comparisons, I would hope that people would want to prevent this from happening again, and not just point the finger and say, well, this happened in the United States, so you shouldn't say anything about it occurring in China, but rather that now that we know how destructive these policies are, that maybe we can speak up and prevent it happening from other people or to other peoples.
John, could I interject here?
Sure, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, that I think a big difference is that the Chinese government so far is reluctant to engage in genocide in a narrow sense. I won't take this is such a fraught issue that, whether this is genocide or not, I'm not going to take a position on that. But genocide in the narrow sense is slaughtering everybody, like the Holocaust. And this, which is essentially, if not a policy, an effect of Anglophone colonialism in North America and Australia, and very unsuccessfully in New Zealand. But so that the China, and also you've got 10 million Uyghurs and another 2 million Kazakhs in Xinjiang. And it's a bigger job, and they're not using military force. The other difference, of course, is that they're aiming this at adults, where the residential schools were aimed at cutting off the generational transmission rather than changing the lifestyles of the people who are already adults. Now, so I think this is likely to, on the other hand, like Tim says, there's a lot more technological tools and a lot more surveillance tools than happened in, in 1870 in Montana. So it's, but I think it has a much less chance of success than the North American project.
Thank you, Tim. Do you have a response? Or?
No, I think that was excellent additions to my comments. I completely agree. I guess that with the boarding school program, so I think that this more recent invasive policies that began with Chen Zhongguo and shortly before him that are targeting adults, those are being imposed in tandem with the boarding school policy that began in 2000 that are recruiting Uyghurs in the thousands. Of course, the difference being we're comparing with Native American boarding schools is that the boarding schools for Xinjiang students are voluntary, whereas the boarding schools for Native Americans they were forcibly.
Of course, you have all these orphan kindergartens for kids whose parents are both incarcerated, which is another facet of it.
Yeah.
Shall we go on to the next question? I'm not sure how many more we should take, maybe 3 or 4. What do you think is the significance of studying the situation of the Uyghurs? To what extent do you think that the CCP will replicate this mode of governmentality, I guess, in Xinjiang to other parts of China, for example, Hong Kong?
These are excellent questions. I mean, it's certainly amongst people in Hong Kong who are worried about increasing influence from Beijing and changing their lifestyles in the city, that they point to Xinjiang as an example, say that this is what could happen, this is what's going to happen if we don't stand up to these policies now. And certainly we're seeing this technology being implemented throughout China. The facial recognitions, for example, so-called, I don't understand all of the dynamics and all of the details of the social credit system, but again, just combing through society and trying to find people that may be prone to criminal activity And again, I think that these were being developed, especially facial recognition being developed and first tested in Xinjiang, and it's now spreading elsewhere in China. So I'm not one to make predictions, but I think that um, we will see, maybe not to the extent, I don't think we're going to see mass incarcerations elsewhere in China, but certainly these kind of proactive attempts to try to identify potential criminals and quote unquote rectify them before they do any wrongdoings. I think that's going to be more of the norm in China.
Okay, I think that answers our next the next question, and I will just go on here. A question about Uyghurs and the policies emphasizing not only their minority, but they're also Muslims, and the Islamic faith is a major factor in this. So Mohammed or Adam Said, I'm keen to know the differences between how the Chinese government sees Uyghurs in the ethnic Hui, many of whom are also Muslims. Maybe you could explain how the Hui is defined as a group.
Yeah, and actually there's no great way for defining the Hui. So in terms of, and I know that, so before the first census, the Chinese Communist Party sought to identify all of its people, and they used several different strategies, and not just Stalin's criteria for a nationality, but that was one of their defining blueprints for how to identify the peoples. And so, in other words, sharing a common territory, sharing a common language, sharing a common economic livelihood, and sharing an psychological makeup that manifests in the culture. And for many groups, they were able to kind of place them neatly using Stalin's criteria. And actually, Thomas Mullany shows that it's not just Stalin's criteria, but we'll simplify it a little bit here. Now, the Hui, though, don't fall in this category, because Hui people, they often speak the language of the locale. So again, they actually exist in every province in China. They have varying degrees of Islamic piety, et cetera, et cetera. So again, they don't share the same language necessarily. They don't share the same geographic location, and the culture themselves, it's more reflective of whatever area it is. Still, pious Hui, up until very, very recently, aren't seeing the types of restrictions on religious practice that Uyghurs have. Now, some places in China now, especially Linxia in Gansu province, and some places in Qinghai, especially Xining, and in Yinchuan, in Ningxia, are starting to have what are these called, these de-Arabization campaigns. But religious practice itself, or Islamic practice itself, hasn't been targeted the same way that Islamic practice in Uyghur communities has, because I believe, according to the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, their version, or their flavor of Islam has already signified over several centuries, whereas Uyghur Islam was more influenced by the cultures that lay beyond the current borders of the People's Republic of China. But it's in the Ming Dynasty, you had Hui intellectuals speaking of Islam using Confucian terms. A lot of Hui mosques retain this kind of this temple style architecture, and so again, it's been over centuries. It's already signified to an extent, and I think that that's one of the main reasons we don't see the type of aggressive policies in all Hui communities that we're seeing in Xinjiang.
Our next question: the Chinese government and culture does not respond well to direct attacks and confrontation in order to initiate change. How can we make Westerners understand that a different approach is necessary in order to make progress in policy and treatment in China?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, unfortunately, one that I don't have the answer to. And if I did have the answer to, then I think that we could maybe relieve the suffering of Uyghurs right now. But certainly the CCP is not going to change their approach to Xinjiang because the U.S. government, especially Mike Pompeo, says to. In fact, I think this is actually going to result in them kind of digging their boots in the sand and standing firm, that they're not going to budge to the United States, who of course has its own record of assimilation, of cultural destruction, genocides of people, and of course killings of Muslims, right? So there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and whataboutery between the two. Now, I think in terms of how what Western governments maybe could do beyond just political rhetoric, and that would be to kind of to cut off the economic incentives of these relationships. And we're seeing that now with cotton importations, that maybe if there's a economic hit to the Chinese government because of this, then they may change their course. But again, I don't think just wavering political sabers by Western countries is the way to go.
Okay, and our last question from Paul Johnson. Do you think we will witness further violence against the Chinese police and security forces as we saw previously, or do you think the new security arrangements now in place, there will be no opportunity or willingness to do so?
Yeah, I believe that the latter will occur. I think right now, most Uyghurs are kind of crippled by fear, and so just performing or expressing any sort of discontent could bring about unpleasant social consequences, maybe legal consequences. And many of the individuals who have been detained are young men born in the 80s and 90s, because these seem to be the individuals who were most likely to carry out who carried out past attacks anyway. So again, I think if people are worried that if they don't conform their home to a certain way, if they don't attend flag raising ceremonies, that's going to that's going to affect them negatively. If these have severe social consequences, I don't think anyone's going to dare, at least in the near future, to stage any sort of violence against security forces. And and then of course there's a fact that there are these Uyghur homes are inspected for weapons and potential weapons, and so even if they did have anything at once, like even kitchen knives have been confiscated from homes depending on the length of the blade. So there's really, I just don't see it happening now.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. We've reached 4:30. We've taken up a good amount of your time and energy, and we thank you very much for a very stimulating session.
Well, thank you so much. It's been
pleasure.
I'm humbled that people trust me to speak about this crisis, and it was a delight to have a homecoming. And thank you for all who attended. I hope you learned something.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.